Washington says drug boats, but the Caribbean just filled with a carrier strike group, amphibious ships and Tomahawks. That's not a police patrol, that's power projection. In this video, we break down the mismatch, why assets built to open war zones are now orbiting Venezuela, and why legal language like non-international armed conflict suddenly appears in press briefings. By the end, you'll see how reviving places like Roosevelt Roads signals a permanent shift, the Caribbean being redefined as a theatre for high-end military options, not a series of episodic interdictions. Before we move on, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video. If this is about drug boats, why does a carrier strike group with Tomahawks sit off Venezuela? The official line says counter-narcotics. The assets say something else. On the water sits an aircraft carrier with its air wing screened by guided missile destroyers and a cruiser, amphibious assault ships steam nearby with marines and landing craft, a nuclear fast attack submarine tracks under the surface. Overhead, P-8 patrol planes sweep sea lanes while long-range bombers, fighters and drones orbit from regional runways. That's the package: sea, air, subsurface, built to dominate a theatre, now assigned to chase contraband, moving in 25-foot boats. Here's what interdiction normally looks like. Coast Guard cutters and maritime patrol planes coordinate with local police units. They board, seize, and detain. They don't need a 100,000-ton carrier, and they don't bring an amphibious-ready group. A typical surge might add a couple of cutters and some aircraft to a corridor. What we have here scales to a contingency, not a patrol. At peak, you're talking around 10,000 troops afloat, roughly 6,000 sailors on the carrier and escorts alone, with reinforcements positioned ashore in Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. That is a task-organized force able to sustain operations, cycle aircraft, and open options far beyond flashing lights and warning shots. Amphibious ships and their marine elements matter because they carry helicopters, tilt rotors, armored vehicles, and the gear to put people on a beach or seize key nodes. They are built for entry operations and crisis response, not sprints after go-fasts. When you add ships that can fire Tomahawk cruise missiles, you add a message: targets hundreds of miles inland are reachable without crossing a border. That capability doesn't help you stop a skiff. It signals long-range strike options against fixed sites, command nodes, or air defenses. Coupled with a fast attack submarine, it rounds out a strike triad that can hit, surveil, and suppress. Now the fentanyl claim. Most fentanyl reaching the US comes from Mexico and enters by land. That's in line with recent threat assessments and seizures at ports of entry. Venezuela shows limited involvement in fentanyl flows based on available reporting. Cocaine routes have shifted heavily to the Pacific over the past decade, with the Caribbean carrying a smaller share. So if the stated target is the biggest driver of overdose deaths, this theatre does not map cleanly to that problem set. Here's the scale mismatch in one scene. A fiberglass go fast, knifes through chop, 2 outboards screaming, 3 crew tossing wrapped bales, an Aegis destroyer, radar arrays lit, tracks from miles away, a helicopter lifts from the carrier, a drone cues the intercept, and a RHIB drops from the destroyer's davits. You don't need a warship covered in vertical launch cells to stop a smuggler tossing contraband. A cutter and a patrol aircraft can do that work daily, but the destroyer isn't there for the skiff. It's there because the mission is larger than the chase. Analysts have flagged this exact point. Carrier groups and amphibious groups are tools for power projection and coercive signaling. They deter, they pressure, and they keep escalation ladders within reach. They are not the default choice for routine interdiction, which relies on law enforcement authorities and lighter maritime assets. That leaves a clean takeaway. The posture lines up with regime pressure and regional dominance, not a narrow police mission. It looks like a deterrent grid that can turn kinetic on short notice. And that brings a deeper risk. When the label on the mission doesn't match the gear in the water, the law tends to stretch to meet the mission, not the other way around. So when did a drug bust turn into an armed conflict that lets you fire on boats in international waters? The answer hides in a quiet shift in wording. For months, officials used the well-worn counter-narcotics label, then the phrasing edged to armed conflict, and later to non-international armed conflict with transnational criminal groups. That change flips legal switches. It moves the framework from law enforcement rules, seizure, detention, evidence, to the law of armed conflict, which permits lethal force against members of an organized armed group, even outside any single state's territory, if certain thresholds are met. That's where the pushback starts. Legal scholars argue that the War Powers Resolution expects Congress to have a direct say when US forces enter hostilities. Rebranding cartel fights as a non-international armed conflict can look like an end run around that requirement. Under international law, it also blurs who counts as a combatant. Cartel members don't wear uniforms, don't carry arms openly in the sense the law expects, and don't fit neatly into the categories built for civil wars. If you treat them as targetable fighters, you stretch definitions built to limit war, not expand it. The stakes aren't academic. Reports tie at least 83 fatalities since September 2025 to actions justified under this new frame. Some deaths occurred far from any coastline, raising questions about how targets were identified and whether civilian vessels were flagged before force was used. Flag state rights come into play too. A ship in international waters falls under its nation's jurisdiction unless clear exceptions apply. Boarding and strikes justified by a conflict against cartels press that boundary, especially when evidence remains classified and partners learn of incidents after the fact. Regional diplomacy feels the heat. CELAC members have flagged the risk of militarizing maritime law enforcement, warning that a security mission could bleed into open-ended operations. CARICOM capital split. Some welcome added assets against traffickers. Others worry about sovereignty and accident risk around busy fishing grounds. In Bogotá, President Petro's government has called for transparency and accountability mechanisms, arguing that cooperation cannot mean a blank check. The Caribbean zone of peace idea, once a shared talking point, now faces the test of constant military presence and episodic strikes. Follow the footprint and you see why. In Puerto Rico, steps to reactivate parts of the former Roosevelt Roads complex restore deep-water berths and logistics nodes close to the Antilles. Forward operating locations in Aruba and Curacao take on expanded roles, with more ramp space, fuel capacity, and hangar time. Discussions circulate about a new radar and communications site in Grenada to knit the picture together. None of that looks temporary. It looks like a grid designed to persist, with faster turnarounds and more options to stage maritime patrols and strike packages. The strategy sits in the details. Special operations teams gain easier access to airfields and pier space. P-8 patrol aircraft get assured basing to extend their time on station. Tomahawk-capable ships cycle through nearby ports, keeping long-range strike within reach not only of Venezuela, but across northern South America. The logic is simple. Embed the ability to act quickly, then keep it there beyond any one crisis or election calendar. One debate hangs over the target set. Intelligence reporting, according to officials briefed on it, tempers claims that Maduro personally controls Tren de Aragua. That complicates the narco-terrorist frame used to widen who can be targeted under an armed conflict theory. If links are weaker or more diffuse, the threshold for naming groups as parties to conflict becomes harder to meet without bending standards.